They tell you about compromise, about communication, about finding your person. What they don't tell you is what happens when your person turns out to be a complete stranger who apparently signed up for a different contract than you did. My name is Marcus Ellison, and let me tell you, I thought I knew what I was getting into when I said I do. Turns out, I was about as prepared for married life as a goldfish is for a triathlon. 6 weeks. That's how long it took for my fairy tale wedding to turn into what I can only describe as the world's most expensive roommate situation. 6 weeks of sleeping next to someone who acted like I had some kind of contagious disease that could be transmitted through casual contact. 6 weeks of trying to hold my wife's hand, only to have her pull away, like I'd just emerged from a nuclear waste facility. 6 weeks of stolen glances across the breakfast table while she scrolled through her phone like I was part of the furniture, and not even the good furniture. More like that weird decorative chair that nobody actually sits in but keeps around because it adds character to the room. Clara Whitmore. Well, Clara Ellison now, though. She seemed to forget that part. Most days had transformed from the woman I fell head over heels for into someone I barely recognized during our whirlwind courtship. She couldn't hell. She even laughed at my impression of my uptight business partner, Jerry, which was honestly pretty generous because even I knew it was garbage. But the moment we got back from our honeymoon in Tuscany, which, by the way, she spent more time photographing for her Instagram than actually enjoying, it was like someone had flipped a switch. Suddenly, every attempt at physical affection was met with the kind of recoil you'd expect if I'd suggested we take up competitive snake charming. A kiss goodnight. She'd turn her head at the last second, offering me her cheek like I was her elderly great-uncle at a family reunion, trying to put my arm around her while we watched Netflix. She'd suddenly remember she needed to organize her skincare routine or respond to some urgent emails that apparently couldn't wait until morning. The worst part wasn't even the rejection itself. I mean, nobody likes getting shot down, but I'm a grown man. I can handle a little disappointment. The worst part was the way she looked at me when I tried. Like I was being unreasonable. Like I was some kind of perverted creep for expecting physical intimacy with my own wife. The same woman who used to send me flirty texts during my board meetings was now treating me like I was asking for her kidney instead of a simple hug. I tried everything, and I mean everything. I bought flowers, the expensive ones from that pretentious florist downtown that charges $50 for what you can get at the grocery store for $10. I planned romantic dinners complete with candles that cost more than most people's monthly coffee budget and wine that I had to Google to make sure I was pronouncing correctly. I even tried the whole surprise weekend getaway thing, booking us into this swanky bed and breakfast in Aspen that looked like something out of a magazine spread. Her response: "I'm not really in the mood for traveling right now, Marcus. Can't we just stay home and relax?" Relaxing, apparently, meant her in one corner of our king-sized bed, a bed we picked out together, laughing about how ridiculously large it was for 2 people, while I occupied the other corner like we were observing some kind of medieval social distancing protocol. The gap between us might as well have been the Grand Canyon for all the good it did me. I remember it was Tuesday, because that was the night we used to order Thai food and binge-watch whatever crime documentary series was trending on Netflix. It was our thing, our little tradition that had carried over from our dating days. Except now, even our Tuesday nights felt like a business meeting between 2 people who barely tolerated each other's presence. I'd been building up the courage all week to have the conversation, you know, the one where you ask your spouse why they're treating you like you're radioactive. So there I was, sitting on our ridiculously expensive Italian leather couch that Clara had insisted we needed for the living room, watching her pick her pad thai while scrolling through her phone for the millionth time that evening. The documentary was playing in the background, something about a serial killer who collected vintage teacups, which honestly seemed less disturbing than my current domestic situation. I took a deep breath, mustered up all the courage I could find, and finally asked the question that had been eating away at me for weeks. "Clara," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable, "the way they teach you in those corporate conflict resolution seminars that every company makes you sit through. Can we talk about us? About what's been going on between us lately?" She looked up from her phone with the kind of expression you'd give someone who just asked you to explain quantum physics using only interpretive dance. "What do you mean?" she asked, though we both knew exactly what I meant. The woman was many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. I continued, feeling like I was negotiating a hostile takeover instead of talking to my wife. "We haven't been intimate at all since the wedding, and I'm just wondering if there's something I've done wrong, or if you're going through something, or if we need to." That's when she hit me with a line that would replay in my head for months afterward. She looked me straight in the eye with a kind of cold, calculated stare that would make a poker player jealous and said, "My body is my choice, Marcus. You can't demand anything from me. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm all for bodily autonomy. I've got it." They were surgical, precise, like she'd been practicing them in the mirror, waiting for just the right moment to deploy them for maximum impact. That night, lying in bed next to someone who felt like a complete stranger, I knew with absolute certainty that something was fundamentally irreparably wrong with our marriage. This wasn't about adjustment periods or newlywed jitters or any of the other explanations I'd been feeding myself for weeks. This was something else entirely, something that made my skin crawl and my gut twist with a feeling I couldn't quite name yet, something that would eventually turn my entire world upside down and teach me that sometimes the person you think you know best is actually the person you don't know at all. You know how they say hindsight is 20/20? Well, let me tell you, looking back at how Clara and I started is like watching a horror movie where you're screaming at the protagonist not to go into the creepy basement, except I'm the idiot protagonist. And the creepy basement was apparently my entire relationship. But at the time, man, I thought I'd hit the romantic jackpot. I was like a kid who'd found a $20 bill on the sidewalk and couldn't believe his luck, completely oblivious to the fact that it might be part of some elaborate prank. It all started at the Hartwell Foundation Charity Gala in Denver. You know, one of those black tie affairs where rich people pretend to care about causes while writing checks that are basically tax write-offs with a side of social media bragging rights. I wasn't even supposed to be there, honestly. This laugh that was like music, but not the pretentious classical stuff they were playing in the background. More like your favorite song on the radio when you're having the best day of your life. I'm not usually the type to get all poetic about sounds. But this laugh made me turn around so fast, I nearly spilled my drink on some society matron who probably would have had me banned from every charity event in Colorado for the next decade. And there she was. Clara Whitmore, though I didn't know her name yet. Just this absolutely stunning woman in a midnight blue dress that probably cost more than my first car, surrounded by a group of people who were all laughing along with her like she was the most fascinating person in the room, which honestly, she might have been. She had this way of commanding attention without seeming to try, like she was born knowing secrets that the rest of us were still trying to figure out. Her hair was this perfect shade of honey blonde that caught the light just right. And when she smiled, it was like someone had cranked up the brightness setting on the entire room. I stood there like an absolute for probably 5 full minutes, just watching her work the crowd. She'd lean in when someone was talking, like whatever they were saying was the most important thing she'd ever heard. She'd touch people's arms when she laughed, not in a flirty way, but in this warm, connected way that made everyone around her feel special. It was like watching a masterclass in human interaction. And I was definitely the remedial student taking notes from the back of the room. Eventually, my brain managed to override my social anxiety long enough to actually approach her. I used some lame line about the charity being close to my heart, which wasn't even a lie since my company had been supporting youth education programs for years. And she didn't just smile politely and move on like I expected. She actually engaged, asked me thoughtful questions about our programs, shared stories about her own volunteer work with literacy initiatives, made me feel like I was the most interesting guy at the party instead of just another businessman in an expensive suit. We ended up talking for the rest of the evening. I missed the keynote speech, the silent auction, probably half the networking opportunities one was supposed to be capitalizing on. And I didn't give a damn. Clara had this way of making everything else fade into the background. She was smart, funny, passionate about causes that actually mattered. And she seemed genuinely interested in me as a person rather than just another potential connection or business opportunity. When she laughed at my stories, and I mean really laughed, not that polite social you do when someone's trying too hard, I felt like I could conquer the world. By the time the evening was winding down, I'd worked up enough courage to ask for her number. She gave it to me without hesitation, along with a smile that made me feel like I'd just won the lottery. "I'd love to continue this conversation sometime," she said. And I swear I floated home that night like some lovesick teenager who'd just gotten asked to prom by the homecoming queen. Our first official date was at this little Italian place in Cherry Creek that she'd recommended. "Nothing too fancy," she said. "Just good food and better conversation." She showed up looking effortlessly beautiful in jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, but somehow made her look approachable instead of intimidating. We talked for 3 hours straight, covering everything from travel dreams to childhood embarrassments to our thoughts on whether pineapple belonged on pizza. We agreed it was an abomination, which I took as a sign we were meant to be. The months that followed were like something out of a romantic comedy, except better because it was actually happening to me. Clara would surprise me at my office with lunch from my favorite deli, complete with those little notes written in her perfect handwriting that I kept in my desk drawer like some kind of sentimental fool. We'd spend entire weekends exploring Denver, hiking in Red Rocks, browsing through bookshops in Capitol Hill, trying new restaurants that she'd found in whatever foodie blog she was obsessed with that week. She had this infectious curiosity about everything, this way of making ordinary activities feel like adventures. She was affectionate in all the ways that mattered. She'd grab my hand when we were walking down the street, curl up against me during movies, send me flirty texts during the day that made me smile like an idiot during board meetings. When we'd go out with my friends, she'd slip her arm through mine and actually participate in conversations instead of checking her phone every 5 minutes like she had somewhere better to be. My buddy Adrian, who's usually about as romantic as a tax audit, actually pulled me aside one night and said, "Dude, I've never seen you this happy. She's good for you." Even my mother approved. And Evelyn Ellison is not easily impressed by the women I date. She'd made it clear over the years that she thought most of my girlfriends were either gold diggers or airheads, sometimes both. But when I brought Clara home for Sunday dinner, Mom actually smiled. Not her polite, "I'm trying to be welcoming" smile, but her genuine, "I like this person's" smile that I hadn't seen directed at one of my dates since well ever. Clara helped with the dishes, asked about Mom's garden, and somehow managed to make my usually reserved mother laugh until she was wiping tears from her eyes. After Clara left that night, Mom grabbed my arm and said, "That one's a keeper, Marcus. Don't screw it up." By the time I proposed, 6 months later, on the balcony of the same hotel where we'd had our first real date, I was absolutely certain I'd found my person. The ring was a 2-carat solitaire that had set me back more than my first car. But seeing her face when I got down on one knee made every penny worth it. She said yes before I even finished my carefully rehearsed speech, threw her arms around me, and kissed me like her life depended on it. We were both crying and laughing at the same time. And I remember thinking that this was what happiness actually felt like. this overwhelming sense of rightness, like all the pieces of my life had finally clicked into place. The wedding planning was a whirlwind of decisions about flowers and venues and guest lists. But Clara threw herself into it with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else. She wanted everything to be perfect, not in a bridezilla way, but in a "this is the most important day of our lives, and I want it to be beautiful" way. We settled on the Highlands Country Club because it had this gorgeous ballroom with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the mountains. And Clara said she wanted our guests to be able to see how beautiful Colorado was while they celebrated with us. The ceremony itself was everything we dreamed of. Clara looked absolutely radiant in her dress, this stunning creation that her mother had helped her pick out with delicate lace sleeves and a train that seemed to go on forever. When she walked down the aisle, I literally forgot how to breathe for a second. She was glowing with happiness, practically floating toward me. And when she reached the altar and took my hands, she whispered, "I can't believe we're actually doing this," with this huge smile that made me fall in love with her all over again. The reception was perfect too. Great food, amazing music, and a dance floor packed with people celebrating our happily ever after. Clara's family had spared no expense, and combined with what my parents contributed, we'd managed to throw the kind of party that people would be talking about for years. During our first dance, Clara looked up at me and said, "I love you so much, Marcus. I can't wait to start our real life together." Looking back now, those words take on a completely different meaning than they had at the time. But in that moment, surrounded by everyone we loved, dancing too, at last by Ida James, while our photographer captured what I thought would be the beginning of our beautiful story, I believed every single word. I believed in us, in our future, in the life we were going to build in our beautiful home, with its perfectly appointed rooms and carefully curated furniture. I believed that the woman in my arms was exactly who she seemed to be, and that our love story was just getting started. What an absolute fool I was. If you've ever watched one of those nature documentaries where they show you a perfectly normal-look log floating in a swamp, and then suddenly it opens its eyes and reveals itself to be a 12-foot alligator that's been waiting to devour some unsuspecting deer, you'll understand exactly what living with Clara became like after our honeymoon. Except in this case, I was the deer, and I was apparently too stupid to notice that my log had developed teeth. The changes started small. The kind of stuff that you tell yourself is just normal adjustment period nonsense. Everyone warned me that the first year of marriage was tough, right? Your bachelor friends shake their heads knowingly and mutter things like, "Welcome to the ball and chain, buddy," while your married buddies pat you on the back and say cryptic like, "You'll figure it out," with a kind of smile that doesn't quite reach their eyes. So when Clara started acting a little different, I chalked it up to post-wedding blues, or maybe just the stress of combining two lives into one perfectly coordinated domestic unit. But then the different became downright bizarre, and I started to feel like I was living with some kind of pod person who had stolen my wife's face but forgotten to download her personality. Clara developed routines that made absolutely no sense to anyone with half a brain cell. She'd disappear for hours at a time with no explanation beyond, "I have errands to run," or "I'm meeting a friend for lunch." Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not some controlling psychopath who needs to know his wife's whereabouts every second of the day. But when your spouse leaves at 10 hours in the morning saying she's going to grab groceries and doesn't come back until 8 at night with nothing but a single bag of organic kale and a story about traffic, that would make a soap opera writer cringe. You start to wonder if maybe she's got a second job as a CIA operative or something. Her phone became like some kind of sacred artifact that mere mortals weren't allowed to touch. Before the wedding, we used to play that stupid game where you try to guess each other's passcodes, and she'd hand me her phone to show me funny videos or cute animal memes that she found on Instagram. Now, the thing was locked down tighter than Fort Knox, and she guarded it like it contained state secrets. She'd get visibly tense if I walked by while she was texting, tilting the screen away from me like I was trying to peek at her diary. One time, I jokingly asked if she was planning my surprise birthday party on there, and she gave me this look that could have frozen hell over and said, "Something should be private, Marcus." The weirdest part was how she seemed to physically relax whenever I left the house. I started noticing it by accident. I'd forget my wallet or my keys and have to double back, only to catch glimpses of her through the window, sprawled out on the couch, looking completely at ease, scrolling through her phone with this little smile on her face that I hadn't seen directed at me in weeks. The second I walked back through the door, though, it was like someone had flipped a switch. The smile would disappear, her shoulders would tense up, and she'd suddenly remember urgent tasks that required her immediate attention in rooms that were as far away from me as possible. I tried everything I could think of to fix whatever was broken between us. I suggested date nights, weekend trips, couples activities that we used to love doing together. Her response was always the same, polite refusal wrapped in perfectly reasonable excuses. "I'm really tired this week, Marcus. Can we maybe do something next weekend?" Next weekend would come and go with the same script, like we were stuck in some kind of Groundhog Day loop, where I was the only one who remembered that we used to actually enjoy each other's company. The counseling suggestion went over about as well as you'd expect. I brought it up on a Sunday morning while we were having what I generously called breakfast together, though it was more like two strangers who happened to be eating cereal in the same kitchen. I'd been building up to it for days, trying to figure out how to frame it in a way that didn't sound like I was accusing her of being fundamentally broken as a human being. "Clara," I said, trying to keep my voice light and non-threatening, "I've been thinking maybe we should try talking to someone, like a marriage counselor or therapist, just to help us figure out how to connect better." She looked up from her Greek yogurt with this expression that was equal parts amusement and disdain, like I just suggested we take up competitive yodeling or join a circus. Then she laughed. Not the beautiful musical laugh that had first caught my attention at that charity gala, but this bitter, sharp sound that made me feel like I just told the world's worst joke. "We don't need therapy, Marcus," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for explaining basic concepts to particularly slow children. "You just need to respect boundaries. Not everything has to be analyzed and fixed. Some things just are what they are." That's when I knew I needed to talk to someone who wasn't slowly driving me insane. Adrian Cole had been my best friend since college, the kind of guy who would tell you if you had spinach in your teeth or if your girlfriend was obviously cheating on you, even if you didn't want to hear it. He was also happily married to Sarah, who was basically the female version of him. Smart, funny, and brutally honest when the situation called for it. If anyone could give me perspective on what the hell was happening in my own house, it was Adrian. I met him for beers at Murphy's Pub on a Thursday night, the kind of dive bar where the peanut shells on the floor are part of the ambiance, you see, and nobody judges you for drinking your feelings. Adrian took one look at my face and ordered us both double whizzies instead of our usual IPAs. "Dude," he said, settling into the worn leather booth across from me, "you look like someone ran over your dog. What's going on?" So I told him everything. The lack of intimacy, the mysterious disappearances, the phone guarding, the way she seemed to barely tolerate my presence in our own home. Adrienne listened without interrupting, nursing his whiskey and occasionally nodding like he was taking mental notes. When I finished my pathetic tale of marital woe, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into his glass like it might contain the secrets of the universe. "Marcus," he finally said, looking up at me with a kind of serious expression that made my stomach clench. "This isn't normal newlywed stuff. Sarah and I went through some adjustment period when we got married. But this sounds like she's actively trying to avoid being married to you, like it all." He leaned forward, lowering his voice, even though the bar was loud enough that nobody could have overheard us anyway. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. Do you think Clara actually wanted to marry you? Or do you think she wanted to marry what you represent, your money, your status, your connections?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut, because it was the same thought that had been creeping around the edges of my mind for weeks. The possibility I'd been desperately trying not to acknowledge, but hearing it out loud from someone whose judgment I trusted implicitly made it impossible to ignore. Even my mother had started making comments. And Evelyn Ellison was not the type to stick her nose into her adult son's marriage unless something was seriously wrong. During our last visit, she'd pulled me aside while Clara was supposedly freshening up in the bathroom. Though given how long she was taking, she might have been performing minor surgery in there. "Marcus, honey," Mom had said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was trying to be diplomatic, but was really just barely restraining herself from saying what she actually thought. "Is everything okay between you and Clara? She seems distant, like she's here physically, but mentally she's somewhere else entirely." When I tried to brush it off as normal married life stuff, Mom had given me that look, the one that said she wasn't buying my for even half a second. "She looks at you like you're a roommate, not her husband," she'd whispered, glancing toward the bathroom to make sure Clara wasn't coming back. "And not even a roommate she particularly likes." Sitting there in Murphy's pub with Adrian, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of other people's ordinary Thursday night problems, I finally admitted out loud what I'd been trying not to think about for weeks. My marriage was a complete disaster, and I had no idea how to fix it. Worse, I was starting to suspect that maybe it couldn't be fixed, because you can't repair something that was broken from the very beginning. The scariest part wasn't even the possibility that my wife didn't love me. The scariest part was the growing suspicion that she never had, and that I'd been such a naive, lovesick fool. That I'd completely missed all the warning signs that were probably flashing like neon lights for everyone else to see. You know that moment in every disaster movie where the hero finally stops trying to reason with the tornado or negotiate with the earthquake and just accepts that nature is trying to kill them? Well, welcome to my Tuesday night epiphany. Brought to you by another spectacular fight about intimacy and the sudden realization that I was married to a human-shaped hurricane who had apparently enrolled in advanced courses on emotional destruction. It started the same way these conversations always did, with me trying to approach the subject like I was defusing a bomb, while Clara acted like I was asking her to donate a kidney to a stranger she'd met on Craigslist. We'd been sitting on opposite ends of our ridiculously expensive couch, watching some Netflix show that neither of us was actually paying attention to when I made the fatal mistake of suggesting we go to bed together. Not for sex, mind you. At this point, I would have been thrilled with basic human contact that didn't involve her flinching away from me like I was radioactive. "Clara," I said, using the same careful tone I perfected for dealing with particularly volatile clients. "It's been 2 months since our wedding. 2 months since we've been close. I'm not trying to pressure you into anything, but I'm starting to feel like we're strangers living in the same house." She looked at me with that now familiar expression of barely concealed irritation, like I was a persistent salesman who couldn't take a hint. "Marcus, we've been over this. I told you that intimacy isn't something you can schedule or demand. It happens naturally or it doesn't happen at all. But it's not happening at all." I pointed out, probably with more frustration in my voice than I intended, and I'm trying to understand why. Did something happen? Did I do something wrong? Because if I did, just tell me so I can fix it. That's when she hit me with a nuclear option. She turned to face me fully, her eyes cold and calculating in a way that made my blood pressure spike, and delivered her verdict with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. Maybe the problem isn't what you did wrong, Marcus. Maybe the problem is that you think you're entitled to something just because we're married. Maybe the problem is that you can't accept that some women don't want to be pawns in their husband's sexual fantasies. I sat there for a moment, processing what she'd just said, feeling like I'd been slapped across the face with a frozen fish. Sexual fantasies. I'd been asking for basic human affection, not auditions for some kind of pornographic fever dream. I wanted to hold my wife's hand, maybe get a kiss that didn't feel like a punishment. Perhaps occasionally sleep in the same bed without an invisible force field between us that would make NASA jealous. "Clara," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice level despite the fact that I was pretty sure my head was about to explode. "I'm not asking for sexual fantasies. I'm asking for my wife to act like she actually wants to be married to me instead of like she's serving a prison sentence." Her response was to laugh, that same bitter, sharp sound that had become the soundtrack to our marriage, and shake her head like I was missing some obvious point that everyone else in the world understood, except me. "You just don't get it, do you?" she said, standing up and smoothing down her silk pajamas that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You think marriage gives you some kind of automatic access to my body, like I'm property you purchased at the altar?" And that's when something inside me finally snapped. Not in a violent throw things around the room kind of way, but in a cold, crystalline moment of absolute clarity that cut through all the confusion and self-doubt I'd been wallowing in for months. I looked at this woman, this beautiful, perfectly put-together woman who had somehow transformed from the love of my life into a stranger who spoke to me like I was something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her shoe, and realized that I was done. Done begging for scraps of affection. Done apologizing for wanting a real marriage instead of whatever twisted roommate situation we'd stumbled into. Done pretending that this was normal or fixable or something that would get better with time and patience and more expensive couples therapy sessions. "You're right, Clara," I said, standing up and looking at her with what I hoped was the same cool detachment she'd been serving me for months. "I don't get it. I don't understand how the woman who couldn't keep her hands off me 6 months ago suddenly finds the idea of basic human contact so personally offensive. But you know what? I'm done trying to figure it out." I walked upstairs to our bedroom, though, let's be honest. It had basically become my bedroom since she'd taken to sleeping in the guest room more often than not, and fired up my laptop. If Clara wanted to treat our marriage like a business transaction, then maybe it was time to start thinking like a businessman instead of a lovesick fool. I'd always been good at research. It's basically half of what running a successful company involves. So I started digging into Colorado marriage law with the same methodical approach I used for due diligence on potential acquisitions. What I found was like discovering a secret weapon I didn't even know existed. Turns out, Colorado recognizes several grounds for annulment that go way beyond the obvious stuff like bigamy or being too drunk to consent. The state actually allows in fraud, concealment, or misrepresentation at the time of marriage. And here's the kicker. If one party enters into marriage under false pretenses, never intending to fulfill the basic obligations of marriage, that constitutes fraud in the eyes of the law. I sat there staring at my laptop screen at 2 in the morning, feeling like a detective who'd just cracked the case that had been driving him insane for months. Clara's behavior wasn't just confusing or hurtful, it was potentially illegal. If she had never intended to consummate our marriage, if she had married me under false pretenses while planning to withhold the basic elements of marital intimacy, then she had essentially committed fraud. The more I researched, the more pieces started falling into place. The whirlwind courtship that had seemed so romantic now looked suspiciously like a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to get me to the altar as quickly as possible. The sudden personality change immediately after the honeymoon, wasn't post-wedding blues. It was the reveal of who she actually was once she'd achieved her objective. The mysterious phone calls and unexplained absences weren't just quirky married life adjustments. They were signs of someone who was living a completely different life than the one she'd signed up for on paper. I printed out page after page of legal precedents, case studies, and statutory requirements, building a file that grew thicker by the hour. There were cases where marriages had been annulled after just a few months because one party had never intended to fulfill their marital obligations. There were precedents for fraud claims based on deliberate misrepresentation during courtship. There were even criminal cases where individuals had been prosecuted for marriage fraud in situations that sounded disturbingly similar to my own. By the time the sun came up, I had a plan. Not a plan to save my marriage. That ship had sailed sometime around Clara's lecture about sexual fantasies and property ownership. But a plan to get out of this disaster with my dignity and my finances intact. If Clara wanted to play games, then game on. But she was about to discover that I was a lot better at this particular sport than she'd given me credit for. The weird thing was how calm I felt once I'd made the decision. For months, I'd been tying myself in knots, trying to figure out how to fix something that was apparently broken by design. I'd been beating myself up, wondering what I'd done wrong, questioning my own sanity and self-worth. But now that I understood what was really happening, that I wasn't failing as a husband so much as I was succeeding as a mark in some kind of elaborate con game, everything suddenly made perfect sense. Clara had played me like a fiddle. But the song was about to end, and unlike the fairy tale she'd sold me during our courtship, this story wasn't going to end with happily ever after. It was going to end with legal documents, court dates, and the kind of justice that only comes when you stop trying to fix what was never real in the first place. I closed my laptop, took a shower, put on my best suit, and prepared to go to war. Because that's what this was now. Not a marriage, not even a relationship, but a battle. And I'll be damned if I was going to lose. Finding the right lawyer is a lot like dating. Except instead of wondering if someone will ghost you after dinner, you're wondering if they'll ghost you after taking your retainer and leaving you high and dry in a courtroom full of people who speak fluent legal jargon while you're still trying to figure out what the hell a motion to compel actually means. Lucky for me, I'd done my homework with the same obsessive thoroughness that had made my business successful. Which is probably the only reason I didn't end up with some ambulance chaser who advertised on late-night TV between commercials for miracle weight loss supplements and get-rich-Q schemes. Patricia Henley came recommended by 3 different sources, all of whom used words like ruthless, brilliant, and the kind of lawyer you want on your side when the hit's the fan. Her office was located in one of those sleek, downtown Denver high-rises that screams, "We charge by the minute, and our minutes are expensive," which honestly made me feel a little better about what I was about to spend. If you're going to pay premium prices for legal representation, you want it to at least look like you're getting premium service, not like you're meeting your attorney in the back booth of a Denny's at midnight. The waiting room was all glass and steel and leather furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars, with abstract art on the walls that looked like someone had sneezed paint on a canvas and called it genius. The receptionist, a woman who looked like she could run a Fortune 500 company in her spare time, offered me coffee that came in actual china cups instead of those flimsy paper things you get at most offices. These were clearly people who understood that presentation matters, especially when you're about to discuss the intimate details of your catastrophic marriage with a complete stranger. Patricia Henley herself was exactly what Central Casting would order if they needed someone to play intimidating female attorney in a legal thriller. She was probably in her late 40s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a style that said, "I don't have time for bullshit." Her office was on the 32nd floor with Florida-to-ceiling windows, that offered a panoramic view of the Denver skyline and the mountains beyond. It was the kind of view that reminded you that there were bigger things in the world than your personal problems, while simultaneously making it clear that the person behind the desk had the kind of success that could afford such reminders. The wall, that's an unusual request for someone who's been married for only a few months. Why don't you tell me what's going on? So I did. I told her everything, starting with that magical first meeting at the charity gala and ending with my late-night research session that had led me to her office. I laid out the timeline of Clara's personality transformation, the complete lack of intimacy, the mysterious phone calls and unexplained absences, the way she seemed to actively avoid being alone with me in our own house. Patricia listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting down notes on a legal pad with handwriting that looked like it had been designed by someone who charged extra for legibility. When I finished my tale of marital woe, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with the kind of expression that made me feel like I was being X-rayed by someone who could see through at the molecular level. The silence stretched on long enough that I started to wonder if maybe I'd misread the situation. If maybe my problems were just normal married life stuff that everyone goes through and I was being a dramatic baby who couldn't handle the adjustment period. Then she leaned forward, placed her hands flat on the desk, and said something that changed everything. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made Supreme Court justices sit up and pay attention. "This isn't just grounds for annulment. If your wife entered into this marriage under false pretenses, if she never intended to fulfill the basic obligations of marriage, then what you're describing is fraud. And if this was about deliberate deception, about someone who had essentially run a con game on me using wedding vows and romantic dinners as cover." "Criminal charges?" I asked, my voice sounding smaller than I would have liked. "You mean like actual jail time?" Patricia nodded grimly, pulling out a thick file folder that she'd apparently prepared while I was telling my story. Marriage fraud is a serious offense in Colorado, especially when significant financial assets are involved. If Clara married you with the intention of gaining access to your wealth and property without ever planning to fulfill her marital obligations, that constitutes fraud under state law. The fact that she insisted on a prenuptial agreement could actually work in our favor here. It suggests premeditation, advanced planning for the dissolution of the marriage. She opened the file and started pulling out documents, case precedents, legal statutes, examples of similar situations that had resulted in both annulments and criminal convictions. "There's a pattern here that I've seen before, Marcus. The whirlwind courtship designed to prevent you from getting to know the real person. The immediate personality change after the wedding, the avoidance of intimacy combined with mysterious behavior and secretiveness. These are classic signs of what we call a marriage con." The term made my stomach clench. A marriage con. Like I was some kind of mark in an elaborate grift. A sucker who'd been played by a professional who specialized in targeting wealthy, lonely men with more money than sense. It was humiliating and enlightening at the same time. Humiliating because it meant I'd been completely fooled by someone I thought I loved. But enlightening because it meant that what had happened to me wasn't my fault. "What do we need to prove it?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the fact that my entire worldview was currently being reconstructed in real time. Patricia smiled, and it wasn't a particularly pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile that made me very glad she was on my side instead of working for the opposition. "We need evidence of premeditation and deception, phone records, financial documents, witness testimony about her behavior before and after the marriage. We need to establish that this was a planned deception rather than just a marriage that went south." She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers in a way that made her look like she was already planning her opening argument. "The good news is that people who run marriage cons usually aren't as careful about covering their tracks as they think they are. They get overconfident, sloppy, They assume their victims won't fight back, that they'll just accept the situation and move on quietly. "And the bad news?" I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to hear the answer. "The bad news is that this is going to get ugly. If Clara is running a con, she's not going to go quietly when we expose her. She'll fight back, probably with accusations designed to make you look like the bad guy. Marriage fraud cases are nasty, public, and emotionally brutal for everyone involved." Patricia stood up and walked over to the windows, looking out at the city spread below us like she was surveying a battlefield where she was about to deploy her troops. "But here's what I can promise you, Marcus. If your wife is a fraud, if she married you under false pretenses with the intention of taking advantage of you financially and emotionally, then we're going to expose her. We're going to make sure that everyone knows exactly what she is and what she's done. And we're going to make sure that she pays for it, both civilly and criminally." She turned back to face me, and the expression on her face was the kind that had probably made grown men weep in courtrooms across Colorado. "The question is, are you ready for that kind of fight? Because once we start down this road, there's no going back. This isn't just about ending your marriage anymore. This is about justice." I thought about Clara's cold laughter, about the way she looked at me like I was something unpleasant she'd found on her shoe, about the months of confusion and self-doubt and wondering what the hell was wrong with me, that my own wife couldn't stand to be in the same room with me. I thought about the beautiful, affectionate woman who had apparently never existed except as a carefully constructed facade designed to get me to the altar. "Yeah," I said, meeting Patricia's eyes with a steadiness that surprised me. "I'm ready. You know how in those old detective movies, the private investigator is always some gruff, chain-smoking guy in a wrinkled coat who operates out of an office that looks like it hasn't been cleaned since the Eisenhower administration? Well, Detective Samuel Torres was nothing like that, which was either really reassuring or deeply disappointing depending on how much you buy into Hollywood stereotypes. Instead of looking like he'd stepped out of a film noir, Torres looked like he could have been modeling for Men's Health magazine mid-40s. Built like he spent serious time in the gym, wearing a suit that actually fit him properly and had been pressed sometime in the current decade. His office, located in a professional building about 10 minutes from Patricia's downtown high-rise, was clean, modern, and organized in a way that suggested someone who took their job seriously instead of someone who survived on bourbon and cigarettes while brooding about the darkness of the human condition. The walls were covered with framed certificates and commendations from his time as a Denver police detective, along with testimonials from grateful clients who'd obviously been happy enough with his work to put their names on his wall for other potential customers to see. Patricia had made the introduction with her typical efficiency, calling Torres while I was still sitting in her office and setting up a meeting for the next day. "Sam's the best investigator in Colorado," she told me as she hung up the phone. "He used to work fraud cases for Denver PD before he went private. If anyone can dig up dirt on your wife, it's him. And trust me, Marcus, if there's dirt to be found, we need to find it before she has a chance to cover her tracks." Torres greeted me with a handshake that was firm without being a macho pissing contest, offered me coffee that was actually decent instead of the battery acid most offices served, and got straight to business in a way that made me understand why Patricia recommended him so highly. He had this way of listening that made you feel like every word you said was being filed away in some kind of mental database that he could access instantly whenever he needed it. "Mr. Ellison," he said, settling behind his desk with a digital recorder and a yellow legal pad that looked suspiciously similar to the one Patricia had used. "Miss Henley filled me in on the basics of your situation, but I'd like to hear it from you directly. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out, no matter how insignificant it might seem. In fraud cases, the devil is always in the details." So I went through the whole sorry tale again, from that first magical meeting at the charity gala to my recent epiphany about marriage law and potential criminal charges. Torres listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting down notes or asking clarifying questions that showed he was paying attention to things I hadn't even realized were important. When did Clara first suggest the prenup? How quickly did she want to set the wedding date? Did she ever ask specific questions about my financial situation that seemed unusual at the time? When I finished, Torres leaned back in his chair and studied me with the kind of expression that made me feel like I was being evaluated by someone who'd seen every possible variation of human deception and wasn't particularly surprised by any of it anymore. The silence stretched on long enough that I started to wonder if maybe my story wasn't as compelling as I'd thought. If maybe I was just another bitter husband who couldn't accept that his marriage wasn't working out. Then Torres leaned forward, his eyes narrowing in a way that made me understand why criminals probably confess to him just to make him stop looking at them like that. "I've seen this pattern before," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd investigated too many cases that started exactly like mine. Quick courtship, lavish wedding, immediate personality change, avoidance of intimacy, mysterious behavior. It's textbook marriage fraud. Marcus, the only question is whether your wife is working alone or if she's part of something bigger. The phrase "something bigger" sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in his office. "What do you mean, something bigger?" Torres opened a file drawer and pulled out a thick folder that looked like it contained enough paperwork to choke a horse. Marriage fraud isn't usually a solo operation. There are organized groups that specialize in this kind of con. They identify targets, research their backgrounds, train the operators, provide backup and support during the operation. If Clara is part of one of these groups, she's not just some woman who decided to scam a wealthy husband for kicks. She's a professional. He opened the folder and started pulling out photographs, documents, what looked like surveillance reports. "I've been tracking a particular network that's been operating in Colorado, Utah, and Nevada for the past few years. They target wealthy, recently divorced, or never married men in their 30s and 40s. The pattern is always the same: whirlwind romance, quick engagement, expensive wedding, then immediate withdrawal and eventual financial settlement through divorce or annulment." Torres spread the documents across his desk, like he was laying out evidence at a crime scene. "The thing is, these people are good at what they do. They're trained to be exactly what their targets are looking for. They study their marks, learn their interests and preferences, become the perfect woman for that specific man. It's not random. It's targeted, professional, and extremely effective." I stared at the photographs scattered across his desk. Pictures of women who could have been Clara's sisters. All beautiful, all polished, all photographed in what looked like surveillance shots taken from a distance. "Are you saying Clara might be part of some kind of marriage fraud ring?" "I'm saying it's a possibility we need to investigate," Torres replied, gathering up the photographs and tucking them back into the folder. "But first, I need to gather evidence about Clara specifically. I need to know where she goes during those mysterious absences, who she's talking to on that phone she guards so carefully, whether she's had contact with anyone who might be coaching her or helping her plan this con." Torres reached into his desk drawer and pulled out what looked like a small black device about the size of a smartphone. "This is a digital recorder with voice activation. It's completely legal to record conversations in your own home in Colorado, as long as you're a party to the conversation. I want you to keep this with you whenever you're talking to Clara. If she slips up, if she says anything that reveals her real intentions or mentions other people who might be involved, we need to have proof." The weight of the device in my hands was surprisingly heavy, like I was holding evidence of my own naivety and stupidity. "You really think she might confess to running a con on me?" Torres smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile that suggested he'd seen people underestimate his investigative skills before and had enjoyed proving them wrong. Criminals get overconfident, Marcus. They start to believe their own cover stories, or they get careless because they think their victims are too stupid or too emotionally invested to fight back. Clara married you because she thought you were an easy mark, wealthy, trusting, probably a little lonely, and eager to please. She's not expecting you to fight back with lawyers and private investigators. He stood up and walked over to a filing cabinet, pulling out what looked like a standard contract. I'm going to do a complete background check on Clara, employment history, previous addresses, financial records, social media activity, the works. I'm also going to put surveillance on her during those mysterious absences of hers. If she's meeting with accomplices or conducting other business related to this con, I'll find out about it. Torres returned to his desk and slid the contract across to me. My rate is $500 a day plus expenses. For a case like this, figure on at least 2 weeks of investigation, maybe more if we uncover evidence of a larger operation. Patricia tells me money isn't an object, but I want you to understand what you're signing up for here. I looked at the contract, thinking about what $500 a day times 2 weeks would cost, then thinking about what it had cost me emotionally to spend the last few months wondering what the hell was wrong with me, that my own wife couldn't stand to be in the same room with me. Money is not an object, I confirmed, signing my name with the kind of flourish that suggested I was finally taking control of my own life, instead of just letting things happen to me. Torres countered, signed the contract, and filed it away in what I assumed was his active cases drawer. One more thing, Marcus. From this point forward, you can't let Clara know that you suspect anything. You need to act like the confused, hurt husband who's still hoping things will get better. If she realizes we're investigating her, she'll either disappear or start covering her tracks in ways that will make our job a lot harder. As I left Torres's office with a recording device in my pocket and a private investigator on my payroll, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not hope that my marriage could be saved, because that ship had sailed somewhere around the time Clara started treating me like I was a registered sex offender. But hope that I might finally get some answers. Hope that I might discover I wasn't crazy or inadequate or fundamentally unlovable, but just the victim of someone who was really, really good at what they did for a living. That night, sitting in my living room while Clara chatted on her phone behind the closed door of what used to be our bedroom, I activated the recording device Torres had given me and waited for my wife to make her first mistake. If you've ever watched a magician perform and then had someone explain exactly how the trick works, you know that moment when the illusion collapses and you can't believe you were stupid enough to fall for something so obvious. That's exactly how I felt when Detective Torres called me 3 days later with information that made my entire marriage look like a masterclass in elaborate deception. Except instead of pulling rabbits out of hats, Clara had been pulling the wool over my eyes while systematically planning to destroy my life. I was sitting in my office pretending to review quarterly reports while actually obsessing over every interaction I'd had with Clara in the past week when Torres' call came through. I'd been carrying that recording device everywhere, waiting for her to slip up and say something incriminating. But so far all I'd captured was her end of boring conversations about yoga classes and dinner plans that sounded suspiciously fabricated. She was being careful, probably more careful than usual, which made me wonder if she'd somehow sensed that something had changed in the dynamic between us. Marcus, Torres said without preamble, his voice carrying that particular tone that investigators use when they're about to deliver news that's going to ruin someone's day. We need to meet. I've got information about Clara that you need to see in person. Can you get away from the office this afternoon? The urgency in his voice made my stomach clench with a combination of anticipation and dread. Part of me had been hoping that Torres would call back and tell me I was being paranoid. That Clara was just a woman going through a rough patch in her marriage, and not some kind of professional con artist. But the way he sounded suggested that my worst suspicions were about to be confirmed in ways I probably wasn't prepared for. An hour later, I was back in Torres's office, watching him spread documents across his desk like he was laying out evidence at a crime scene. Except this time, the crime scene was my life. And I was apparently both the victim and the last person to figure out what had been happening right under my nose. "Okay," Marcus Torres said, settling into his chair with a kind of expression that made me want to pour myself a stiff drink, even though it wasn't even 3 hours in the afternoon. "I'm going to give this to you straight, and it's not going to be pleasant. Your wife isn't just avoiding intimacy with you. She's been living a completely separate life that she's been very careful to keep hidden." He picked up what looked like an official document with several stamps and seals on it. "Let's start with the big one. Clara Whitmore was married before to a man named David Sterling in Las Vegas, Nevada in 2019. According to Nevada state records, that marriage was never legally dissolved. Their divorce proceedings were initiated but never finalized, which means that technically Clara was still married to another man when she married you." The words hit me like a physical blow. Bigamy. My wife was a bigamist. Not just a cold, unaffair spouse, but someone who had committed an actual crime by marrying me while still legally married to someone else. I sat there staring at the marriage certificate Torres had somehow obtained, trying to process the fact that my entire wedding had been not just a sham, but literally illegal. "It gets worse," Torres continued, pulling out another set of documents. David Sterling filed a police report in Nevada 6 months after Clara left him, claiming that she had defrauded him out of nearly $200,000 through forged checks and unauthorized credit card charges. The case was never prosecuted because Clara had disappeared and they couldn't locate her. But the report is still on file. I felt like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. Some thriller where the protagonist discovers that his perfect wife is actually a sociopathic criminal who specializes in destroying men's lives for profit. Except this wasn't a movie, and the devastated husband staring at evidence of his wife's crimes was me. "There's more," Torres said, though I wasn't sure how much more I could handle without my brain completely short-circuiting. "I've been conducting surveillance on Clara during her mysterious absences, and she's been meeting regularly with a man named Lucas Crane. Crane has a record. He's been arrested twice for marriage fraud, though he was only convicted once. He served 18 months in a Colorado state prison for running a romance scam that built 3 different women out of a combined total of $500,000. Torres pulled out surveillance photographs that showed Clara sitting in what looked like an upscale coffee shop with a man who appeared to be in his 50s, well-dressed, the kind of guy who could probably charm his way into your bank account while you thanked him for the privilege. They were leaning in close, talking intently, and Clara's body language was completely different from anything I'd seen from her in months. She looked engaged, animated, alive in a way that she never looked when she was with me. Based on these meetings and some financial records I was able to obtain, it appears that Clara and Crane have been working together to identify and target wealthy men for marriage fraud schemes. You're not her first victim, Marcus, and if we hadn't started investigating when we did, you probably wouldn't have been her last." The room started to feel like it was spinning slightly, and I had to grip the arms of my chair to keep myself anchored to reality. Everything I thought I knew about my wife, about our relationship, about myself, was collapsing faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. The woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman I'd married in front of 200 guests in the most beautiful ceremony I could afford, had never existed except as a carefully constructed facade designed to separate me from my money. "The really sick part," Torres continued, seemingly oblivious to the fact that I was having what might have been a minor psychological breakdown, "is how professional this operation is. They research their targets extensively. Your business, your family background, your interests, your previous relationships. Clara became exactly the kind of woman you'd fall for based on information they gathered about you beforehand. He pulled out what looked like a dossier with my name on it, filled with details about my life that I'd never shared with Clara directly. My college major, my hobbies, my mother's name, even details about my previous girlfriend and why we'd broken up. It was like reading a FBI file on myself, except it had been compiled by criminals who were using the information to destroy my life. How did they get all this? I asked, my voice sounding strange and distant, even to my own ears. Social media, public records, mutual acquaintances who didn't realize they were being pumped for information, Torres explained. It's surprisingly easy to build a comprehensive profile on someone if you know what you're looking for and you're willing to put in the time. That's when he dropped the final bombshell. The piece of evidence that transformed my confused herd into something approaching pure rage. He reached over to his computer and pressed play on an audio file that filled the room with the sound of Clara's voice. Except she didn't sound anything like the woman I'd been living with for the past few months. Her voice was warm, affectionate, intimate in a way that made my chest tight with recognition and fury. "Don't worry, baby," she was saying to someone who definitely wasn't me. "I'll be free soon. The plan is working perfectly. Marcus is so confused and desperate that he's not even questioning why I won't sleep with him anymore. Once we file for the annulment, I'll get access to the settlement money we negotiated in the prenup, and then we can disappear together like we planned." The voice that responded was male, presumably Lucas Crane, and he sounded pleased with her progress. "You're sure he won't fight the annulment?" He seemed pretty smitten during the surveillance we did before the wedding. Clara's laugh was the same musical sound that had first attracted me at that charity gala, except now it sounded like nails on a chalkboard. Marcus is a sweet, naive man who thinks love conquers all. He'll be so relieved to get out of this marriage that he won't question the financial arrangements. Besides, he's too much of a gentleman to drag me through a nasty divorce. He'll take whatever deal we offer him just to make the whole thing go away, quietly. I sat there listening to my wife discuss my emotional destruction like it was a business transaction, feeling something inside me die and get replaced by something much colder and infinitely more dangerous. The woman I'd love, the woman I'd married, the woman I'd been torturing myself trying to understand and please, had never existed. She was a character in an elaborate play, and I'd been the unwitting audience member who'd somehow ended up on stage without realizing the performance had started. Marcus Torres was looking at me with what might have been concern, though it was hard to tell through the red haze that had descended over my vision. "Are you okay?" I looked at him and felt my face arrange itself into what I hoped was a smile, though it probably looked more like a snarl. "I'm perfect," I said, and meant it, because for the first time in months, I understood exactly what was happening and exactly what I needed to do about it. Clara thought she was running a con on a naive, lovesick fool who would roll over and play dead when she was ready to cash out. What she didn't realize was that she just handed me everything I needed to destroy her completely, and I was more than ready to return the favor. You know what they say about revenge being a dish best served cold? Well, let me tell you. After sitting in Patricia's office listening to her explain our strategy for destroying Clara's little con game, I was feeling downright arctic. This wasn't going to be some messy, emotional confrontation where I screamed about betrayal and threw her designer clothes out onto the lawn like some reality TV drama. No, this was going to be surgical, calculated, and absolutely devastating in all the best ways. Patricia had crafted our approach with the kind of precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker jealous. We were going to let Clara think she was winning right up until the moment we pulled the rug out from under her perfectly pedicured feet. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. We'd file for annulment exactly like she expected, making it look like I was too heartbroken and confused to fight for anything more than a quick, quiet escape from our disaster of a marriage. The key, Patricia explained while spreading legal documents across her conference table like she was planning a military invasion, is to make Clara believe she's gotten exactly what she wanted. She thinks you're a pushover who'll accept whatever terms she dictates just to make the pain stop. We're going to encourage that belief right up until we spring the fraud evidence on her in court. The prenuptial agreement that Clara had insisted on, which at the time I'd thought was just her being practical about protecting her family's money, was about to become the rope she'd unknowingly fashioned for her own legal hanging. She'd negotiated terms that would give her a substantial settlement in case of annulment, clearly believing that a sad, desperate Marcus would just hand over the cash to make his embarrassing marriage disappear quietly. What she didn't know was that fraud invalidates contracts. Every single clause she'd so carefully negotiated, every financial protection she'd built into our agreement, would become worthless toilet paper the moment we proved she'd entered the marriage under false pretenses. Instead of walking away with a nice chunk of my assets, she'd be walking away in handcuffs. For the next 2 weeks, I played my part like I was auditioning for an Oscar. I moped around the house, acted defeated and confused, made it clear that I just wanted our nightmare marriage to end as quietly as possible. When Clara suggested we discuss our options, which was apparently Connor to speak for, "Let me explain how much money you're going to give me to go away." I nodded sadly and agreed that maybe it would be best for both of us. Clara's smugness during those conversations was almost impressive in its complete lack of self-awareness. She'd pat my hand sympathetically while explaining how much better we'd both be once we moved on from this mistake, completely oblivious to the fact that I was recording every word and that her idea of moving on was about to collide headfirst with multiple felony charges. "You'll regret losing me someday, Marcus," she told me one evening, her voice dripping with fake sympathy that made my skin crawl. "But I think we both know this marriage was doomed from the start. Some people just aren't compatible, no matter how much they want to be. If I hadn't known she was basically reading from a script designed to manipulate me into accepting financial ruin, I might have actually felt guilty about what was coming next. But sitting there listening to her perform her concerned wife routine while knowing she was planning to disappear with Lucas Crane the moment she got her hands on my money, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The legal system was about to give Clara Whitmore the education of her lifetime, and I was going to have front row seats to watch her discover that some marks fight back harder than expected. The day of the hearing, Clara walked into that Denver courtroom like she was stepping onto a red carpet at some fancy awards show. She'd chosen her outfit carefully. A conservative navy suit that screamed, "Respectable wife who's been wronged," paired with just enough jewelry to remind everyone that she came from money, but not so much that she looked greedy. Her lawyer, some slick operator she'd hired with what I assumed was her family's money, looked equally confident as they took their seats across from Patricia and me. I have to admit, watching Clara perform her grieving wife routine was almost impressive. When her attorney argued that I was just an impatient husband who couldn't respect her boundaries, she managed to look appropriately wounded, like she was the victim of some terrible misunderstanding rather than a career criminal who'd made the mistake of targeting the wrong mark. Then Patricia stood up, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop about 20 degrees. She walked to the evidence table with the kind of calm confidence that made everyone pay attention, including the judge, who looked like he'd seen enough divorce drama to fill several seasons of daytime television, but was suddenly interested in what was about to unfold. "Your Honor," Patricia began, her voice carrying across the courtroom like she was delivering a sermon to the faithful. "We have evidence that Mrs. Whitmore—" Her mouth opened slightly in what might have been shock or horror. And for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely afraid. But Patricia wasn't done. She revealed the Nevada marriage license, the evidence of Clara's previous fraud conviction, the surveillance photos of her meetings with Lucas Crane. Each piece of evidence hit Clara like a physical blow. And I could see her lawyer frantically scribbling notes while probably calculating how quickly he could distance himself from this disaster. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps as Patricia laid out the full scope of Clara's deception. The judge's face hardened with each revelation, his expression shifting from mild interest to complete disgust as he realized the extent of the fraud that had been perpetrated in his jurisdiction. "Mrs. Whitmore," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. "It appears you entered this marriage under fraudulent circumstances. This court not only grants the annulment, but refers your case for criminal review." For the first time since I'd known her, I saw the real Clara. Not the charming socialite or the cold manipulator, but a frightened woman who just realized her entire world was about to collapse. The annulment was finalized faster than Clara could say criminal defense attorney. Within a week, the woman who'd walked into that courtroom expecting to collect a nice settlement check was instead facing charges of fraud, bigamy, and conspiracy. The Whitmore family, who'd spent a fortune on our wedding to show off their social status, suddenly found themselves scrambling to do damage control as their daughter's mug shot made the rounds on local news and social media. Clara herself went from Denver socialite to cautionary tale overnight. The same charity galas and country club events where she'd once held court now whispered about her behind closed doors. And her carefully curated Instagram account disappeared faster than free samples at Costco. "Lucas, I knew something was wrong with that girl," she said, though she was kind enough not to add, "I told you so." The most shocking thing wasn't how quickly Clara's empire of lies collapsed once the truth came out. It was how strong I'd become in the process of fighting back. I'd gone from confused victim to someone who dismantled a professional con operation. And honestly, that felt better than any marriage ever could have. Clara had taught me an expensive but valuable lesson. Sometimes the person you think you love is just a mirror showing you what you want to see. The real victory wasn't just getting my freedom back. It was learning that I was a hell of a lot tougher than either of us had given me credit for.